Step into the quiet storm of ticking clocks and fading echoes. The retirement home. A place where time doesn't just slow, it warps. Hallways hum with half-remembered stories, wheelchairs creak like unsettled ghosts, and the air tastes of nostalgia laced with something darker. For caregivers, this is a realm of fragile hearts and fractured memories, where they mend loneliness with bingo nights, pill trays, and forced smiles. But what happens when the past refuses to stay buried? What if these walls aren't just keeping people out? They're keeping something in. Forget peaceful twilight years. These are unfiltered confessions from aides and nurses who've seen the uncanny fester behind rose-patterned curtains, where dementia patients chant names of long-dead strangers, night shift footsteps trace empty rooms, and the sweet scent of lilacs, no flowers in the building, clings to rooms hours before someone dies. Stories of TVs blaring static in vacant suites, of shadowy figures rocking in chairs vacated at dawn, and residents who swear they're sharing their beds with visitors from decades gone. This isn't about aging. It's about the screams no one hears, the widow who whispers perfect details of her husband's car crash years after her Alzheimer's diagnosis, the man who plays chess alone and wins, the eerie lullabies drifting from the sealed-off attic. Are these just misfiring neurons? Or proof that some souls linger, waiting to reclaim what time stole? Listen closely. These halls don't just hold the elderly, they hoard secrets, regrets, and something hungry that feeds on forgotten things. You'll never write off a senior moment again. My name is Lisa Davis, and I need you to believe me. Not for my sake, but for theirs, the ones still trapped behind Willowbrook's ivy-choked walls, where the air smells like mothballs and lies. I started there in '09, fresh out of nursing school. Willowbrook Retirement Home was all creaking oak floors and sun-stained curtains, nestled against a forest that never stopped sighing. The residents were my family, Mrs. Turner with her crossword obsessions, Mr. Brooks who hid whiskey in his oxygen tank, and Mr. Anderson. God, Mr. Anderson. Sharp as a tack at 80, always spinning stories about his Iowa farm days. You ever wrangle a bull, Lisa? He'd rasp, grinning like a kid. Tougher than these old bones, I'll tell ya. It began with the itching. Mr. Anderson started scratching his arms raw during bingo nights. Crawlers, he'd mutter, eyes wild. They're digging tunnels under my skin. I chalked it up to neuropathy until I lifted his sleeve. Raised red tracks snaked up his forearm, throbbing like veins. Then Mrs. Turner screamed during sponge bath day, "Something's moving!" And Mr. Brooks tore at his collarbone with cracked nails, sobbing about worms in the meat. Dr. Patel rolled his eyes. Delusions. Common in the elderly. He prescribed antipsychotics. But I saw it. One night, changing Mr. Anderson's bandages, a black tendril slithered out of a lesion, thick as an earthworm, glistening. It plopped onto the floor, writhing, before dissolving into smoke. The hospital found parasites. Rare, but treatable, the ear doc said. Yet no tests identified the species. No eggs. No source. And the nightmares, God, the nightmares. Residents woke shrieking about a thin man, with a rusted scythe, laughing in the woods. I dug into Willowbrook's history. Turns out the land was a beet farm in the 1930s, owned by Jacob Green, a laborer who hanged himself in the barn after the bank seized his fields. Local legends said he'd hexed the soil, vowing, "My roots'll outlive yours." The attic crawlspace held answers. Dust-choked ledgers revealed Jacob wasn't just in the ground. He was under Willowbrook. I found his unmarked grave behind the tool shed at midnight, shovel in hand. His skeleton gripped a corroded blade, the bone etched with symbols. That's when the earth moved. Something burrowed into my palm. By dawn, the worms were in me. You don't forget the feeling, hot, squirming knots beneath your flesh, climbing toward your heart. I locked myself in the med room, scalpel trembling, and carved open my forearm. Black threads poured out, hissing as I torched them with rubbing alcohol. That's when he appeared, Jacob Green, translucent and rotted, moss spilling from his ribs. "You think burnin' my children'll save you?" he croaked. "I'm in the walls. In the water. In every breath these sinners take. I didn't sleep for 3 days. We called a priest, Father McCready, a chain smoker with a shotgun. He blessed the well, salted the doorways, and read psalms over Jacob's grave. The worms retreated, mostly. Mr. Anderson recovered, though he won't look at the woods anymore. The home's quieter now, except for the whispers. But last night, I woke to a scratch inside my closet. My arm itched. And far off, through the cracked window, I heard it, Jacob's laugh, wet and low, carried on the wind. So yeah, they're gone. But I still check my skin every morning. Still taste dirt when I drink the coffee. And when the shadows in Willowbrook's halls seem a little thicker, I know he's waiting. Pinecrest Retirement Village was David Smith's escape. Its grand common room, with plush chairs and a view of rolling hills, soothed him. The star was the upright piano, played daily by Mr. Johnson, 88, whose fingers flew like a maestro's. David loved the music, a thread to happier days, until Mr. Johnson whispered, "Margaret's playing it at night." Margaret, his late wife, had owned the piano. David dismissed it as longing, but Mrs. Hayes heard it too, a lullaby drifting past midnight. Mr. Gordon swore he saw the keys move alone. David stayed late, watching the moonlit piano. At 1 a.m., it sang Margaret's lullaby, notes crisp, the bench empty. He touched the keys, they burned with cold. The piano's history unraveled. Margaret donated it in 1955, dying in a crash soon after. David played her songs, whispering to her spirit. One night, the keys danced with him, a duet with an invisible partner. A voice sighed, "I miss him." Then a crash, Mr. Gordon fell, claiming a woman pushed him. David found a photo under the piano lid. Margaret, smiling, her eyes hollow. He staged a séance, residents clutching candles. The piano roared to life, keys slamming, a figure flickering, Margaret, weeping. She pointed to the basement. There, David found her diary. She'd been fleeing a stalker the night she crashed. The music stopped after he burned it, honoring her truth. Mr. Johnson played one last time, passing that night. The piano sits silent, a rose on its bench, but David hears faint notes on stormy evenings. Maple Grove Retirement Home was Jessica Lee's cozy kingdom. 50 residents filled its halls with laughter, the air thick with oatmeal cookies and yarn. Jessica cherished Mrs. Wilson, an 85-year-old knitter whose tales of her youth sparkled with wit. But when Mrs. Wilson arrived with a locked box, unveiling a ruby necklace, "My grandmother's curse," she called it, Jessica's world darkened. Mrs. Wilson wouldn't touch it. "It killed my family, greed, madness, death." Jessica humored her, but unease crept in. Mrs. Carter tripped and broke her hip after dusting Mrs. Wilson's shelf. Mr. Patel collapsed, clutching his chest post-repair job. Mrs. Kim's lungs seized after borrowing a scarf. Coincidence, Jessica told herself, until she held the necklace. The ruby pulsed, warm and heavy, and a voice whispered, "Wear me." She dropped it, skin crawling. Nightmares followed, the necklace choking her, blood dripping from its clasp. Residents grew sicker, fevers, falls, fear in their eyes. Jessica confided in Tom, the janitor. "Evil," he muttered, eyeing the box. "Get rid of it." She hesitated, but after Mrs. Wilson died, her heart stopped mid-knit. Jessica acted. She buried the necklace in the woods, dirt under her nails. A laugh echoed, "You can't run." Next dawn, it sat on Mrs. Wilson's dresser, gleaming. Panic surged. She pawned it. The shop burned, the owner dead. She tried melting it. The furnace exploded, singeing her arm. Residents saw shadows, heard cries. Jessica dreamed of a woman in black, Mrs. Wilson's grandmother, demanding the necklace back. One night, it appeared around Jessica's neck, tightening. She clawed it off, hurling it into the lake. The water churned, red waves lapping the shore. She quit, moved states, but the ruby haunts her dreams, dangling, whispering, promising doom if she doesn't reclaim it. Last week, a package arrived. A locked box, a familiar weight inside. Oakwood retirement community buzzed with life, 100 residents, big windows, and a sprawling campus Michael Brown adored. He knew everyone's quirks, Mrs. Lopez's crosswords, Mr. Evans's puns, and Mr. Jenkins's peppermint candies. The 90-year-old widower was Michael's favorite, slipping him sweets and reminiscing about his wife, Eleanor. 8 years at Oakwood had taught Michael patience, but nothing prepared him for what came next. It started with a confession. Mr. Jenkins shuffled in one morning, pale and shaky. "She's here, Michael. Eleanor's watching me sleep." Michael smiled, assuming grief fueled the tale. But Mr. Jenkins pressed on, "A tall shadow by my bed, silent as death." Soon, Mrs. Lopez whispered of a dark lady in her doorway. Mr. Evans saw her too, a woman's silhouette gliding past his window. Michael's gut twisted. He stayed late, staking out Mr. Jenkins's room with a flashlight. The old man snored, the clock ticked, and then the temperature plummeted. A shadow loomed, tall, feminine, her dress swaying as if caught in a breeze. She turned, her gaze a cold blade through Michael's chest. He blinked, she was gone. The next night, residents reported icy hands brushing their faces, whispers begging for help. Michael dug into Oakwood's past. Eleanor, a nurse in the 1960s, died falling down the main stairs, or so the story went. Rumors hinted at a push, a jealous rival, a hushed scandal. He found a faded photo in the archives, Eleanor, stern and beautiful, holding a peppermint jar. His supervisor scoffed at his theories, but the sightings escalated. Mr. Jenkins woke screaming, "She's mad, Michael. She wants the truth." Desperate, Michael pried open a sealed basement hatch. Amid cobwebs, he found a nurse's log, Eleanor's, detailing abuse by a coworker who'd vanished after her death. That night, the shadow returned, sharper, her voice a hiss, "Tell them." She led him to the stairs, where a loose banister rattled, a clue to her fall. He pushed the director for an inquiry. She fired him instead. The final night, Eleanor appeared fully, pale, furious, her neck twisted unnaturally. "Justice," she rasped, her hand clamping his wrist, leaving frost burn. Michael fled Oakwood, urging Mr. Jenkins to leave too. The old man died peacefully days later, a peppermint in his hand. Michael hopes Eleanor rests, but her shadow lingers in his peripheral vision, a silent plea unresolved. Sunnydale Retirement Home was Emily Johnson's haven. Its sunflower yellow walls and creaky wooden floors welcomed her every morning, and the 60 residents felt like family, Mrs. Thompson with her endless scarves, Mr. Carter with his war stories, and Mrs. Rivera with her soap opera obsession. Emily thrived in the routine, meds at dawn, bingo at noon, bedtime tales by dusk. But as autumn painted the trees crimson, an unsettling chill seeped into Sunnydale. It began with a murmur. Emily was stacking bingo cards when she heard it, a faint hum, like a distant crowd chattering. She checked the TV, the radio, the ancient heating vents. Nothing. She laughed it off, blaming the old building's quirks. But the sound clung to her, a persistent itch in her mind. Days later, Mrs. Thompson clutched her arm, eyes wild. "The walls are whispering, Emily. They know my secrets." Emily patted her hand, citing dementia, but then Mr. Carter growled, "They call my name at night, James, James, like they're taunting me." Mrs. Rivera shivered, claiming the voices spoke of buried sins from Sunnydale's past. Doubt gnawed at Emily. She confided in Sarah, her bubbly coworker, over lukewarm coffee. "Pipes," Sarah said, smirking. "This place is older than dirt." Emily nodded, but the whispers grew sharper. One midnight shift, alone in the hallway, she froze. The air thickened and a voice hissed from the wall, "Emily!" Her flashlight clattered to the floor. She pressed her ear to the plaster, heart hammering, and heard, "You're not wanted here." Shadows flickered at the hall's end, tall, thin figures that vanished when she blinked. The next day, Emily stormed the town library, digging through dusty records. Sunnydale, she learned, had been a hospital for the criminally insane in the 1940s. Patients died in droves. Some starved, some worse, under a corrupt director who buried the truth. Back at work, the whispers turned vicious. Residents cowered in the common room, refusing their beds. Emily's dreams twisted into nightmares of gaunt faces screaming through cracked walls. One stormy night, the whispers roared, "Get out or die." Lightning illuminated a figure, a skeletal man in a tattered gown, standing in her office. She screamed and he vanished. Hours later, Mrs. Thompson was found dead, her face frozen in a silent shriek. "Heart failure," the coroner said. Emily doubted it. She confronted Mr. Jenkins, a 92-year-old former orderly. His voice trembled. "The patients never left. They're angry, Emily. Always angry." Panic spread. Footsteps echoed behind her on empty shifts, cold fingers brushed her neck. She found a hidden cellar door, its lock rusted shut. Inside, yellowed files detailed torture and unmarked graves beneath Sunnydale. That night, the whispers became a chorus. "Join us." Shadows lunged, pinning her against the wall, their icy grips searing her skin. She broke free, resigned on the spot, and fled. At home, miles away, the whispers followed, faint, relentless, promising she'd never escape Sunnydale's ghosts.